Hi everyone, welcome to WION Live broadcast from New York City. I'm Susan Tehrani. First, let's get you up to speed with this hour's headlines before we go straight into our first story. The Defense Ministry says that its troops continued to advance into the depth of the enemy's defense and liberated the settlements located southwest of the Russian-held city of Donetsk. Russian President Vladimir Putin will visit North Korea and Vietnam in the coming weeks. Earlier, the Biden administration had warned Pyongyang against providing Putin a platform to promote his war of aggression. Iran chimes in, says Benny Gantz's resignation from Israel's war cabinet is a sign of the country's internal collapse. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken arrives in Tel Aviv after visiting Egypt during a fresh West Asia tour to push for a much-awaited Gaza ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. The criminal trial of President Joe Biden's son Hunter is heading into its final stretch as the defense tries to chip away at the prosecution's case, laying bare some of the darkest moments of Hunter Biden's drug-fueled past. The India-Pakistan game delivers the perfect script as cricket attempts to conquer America. I was there and brought back a ground report on what made this T20 World Cup clash a Sunday blockbuster.
To admit, I'm not exactly a seasoned fan myself. However, who helped me understand the game a little more.
In a move reminiscent of the Cold War, Russia has alarmed the West by deploying nuclear-capable submarines in America's backyard. This provocative action has heightened tensions, drawing parallels to the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Our next report tells you why many believe the West is to blame equally for this inflaming action by Russia.
The world watched in horror as the Cuban Missile Crisis nearly plunged the planet into nuclear war in 1962. Now, decades later, tensions are at a boiling point once again, with Russia sending a nuclear-powered submarine to Cuba, America's backyard. The Russian naval group, including the frigate Gorshkov and nuclear-powered submarine Kazan. Admiral Gorshkov is the first Russian Navy warship to operationally deploy the new Zircon hypersonic cruise missiles. The Russian flotilla will visit the port of Havana between June 12 and 17. Cuba, a key ally of the former Soviet Union during the Cold War, insists that none of the ships carry nuclear weapons and that their stopover does not represent a threat to the region. However, the strategic message Moscow is sending is clear and loaded with implications. The latest Russian deployment near Cuba comes amid escalating tensions between Moscow and the West over the war in Ukraine. Russian President Vladimir Putin has announced the deployment of weapons close to Western nations. Now, Russia's state TV has aired a map showing locations including Mexico, Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, and Yemen, where Putin plans to send missiles. Moscow's aggressive stance follows NATO countries' decision to send military aid to Ukraine, including long-range missiles and authorized strikes within Russian territory. Ukraine claims that for the first time it hit a latest generation Sukhoi 57 fighter jet at an airbase inside Russia. As NATO continues to supply Ukraine with increasingly potent weapons, including the authorization of strikes within Russia, Putin seems to be determined to match escalation with escalation. The world watches, hoping that, like in 1962, cooler heads will prevail. But in this new era of brinkmanship, the margin for error is perilously thin. Bureau Report, WION. World is one.
We are now being joined by Glenn Carl, former National Intelligence Officer from the CIA and National Security and Foreign Policy expert. Glenn, welcome back to WION. Cuba says that none of the Russian warships have nuclear weapons, but still, do you think that the United States should be alarmed?
Well, this is an old gambit, which is not to dismiss its significance. You talked about in your previous profile, a report, the Cuban Missile Crisis. That has continued for 65 years. In the late 1970s, there was another flurry of concern when it appeared that the Russians were doing the same thing during President Carter's administration. His reaction blew the situation out of proportion. Actually, he presented it as an existential threat and suffered politically for it when it hadn't changed the circumstances. I would view this event as the latest chapter of the same story, really. Clearly, as you said correctly, this is Russia's response to America's support or evolving support for Ukraine. But like the White House spokesman has said in the last couple of days, the U.S. will monitor this. It doesn't change the strategic equation. The tensions are high, but it's a tit for tat, I beat my breast, you beat yours kind of circumstance. And I wouldn't be particularly alarmed. It doesn't change the strategic or even day-to-day circumstances. It's just a sign of tensions, but I don't find it as increasing the likelihood of war.
Do you think the lack of dialogue between Moscow and Washington is making the present situation more precarious in one way or the other?
Yes, I think that's I think that is a significant point. The one good thing, almost, to have come out of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 was the establishment of what was called, I think, the hotline or the red phone, or the hotline was a red phone. In any event, a formal process between then the Soviet Union and the United States to communicate during times of great crisis so as to avoid or try to avoid an unintended event to trigger an uncontrollable clash. And the fact that the United States and Russia today are having trouble communicating is alarming. You always want to communicate, even to your enemies at a time of war, with your enemies at a time of war, through one channel or another. And the more communication, the better the chance of avoiding an unintended cascade of events. So that is alarming. And you can see in U.S.-Chinese relations, which have been deteriorating for years, in the last 18 months, I would say, there have been clear signs both by Beijing and by Washington to try to reestablish communications, and that has had some positive effects. It would be far better were the United States and Russia to be able to get on that path again, too. Yes, that's an important point.
Glenn Carl, thank you so much for joining us on WION and for that analysis. We'll be following the story, of course, very closely, and I do look forward to speaking to you again very soon.
Always happy to do so.
On to the Middle East, where U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken has wrapped up his Cairo visit and left for Tel Aviv, where he is expected to hold talks with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. His visit to Cairo was aimed at pushing for a Gaza ceasefire plan. It was the 8th visit by the top U.S. diplomat to the region since the October 7th Hamas attacks. Holding talks with Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken said that leaders West Asia should press Hamas to agree to the U.S. proposal for a Gaza truce with Israel. Joe Biden, who has stepped up efforts to end the war, while Biden has described his plan as coming from Israel, the resignation on Sunday of a key centrist member, Benny Gantz, from Netanyahu's war cabinet throws a new wild card on U.S. diplomatic efforts. Under the plan laid out by Biden, Israel would withdraw from Gaza's populated centers and Hamas would free hostages. The ceasefire would last an initial 6 weeks, with the truce extended as negotiators seek a permanent end to hostilities. The UN World Food Program has also paused its distribution of humanitarian aid from American-built pier off Gaza, citing safety concerns. The UN announcement of the pause is the latest setback for the U.S. sea route set up to try to bring more aid to Gaza's starving population. The UN agency has not given any detail, including how long the pause would last. Meanwhile, the United States announced on Sunday that it has requested a UN Security Council vote on its draft resolution backing a plan for an immediate ceasefire for the release of hostages between Israel and Hamas. It did not, however, specify a vote date.
I now give the floor to those members of the Council who wish to make statements.
Iran's Guardian Council has approved the country's hardline parliament speaker and 5 others to contest the country's presidential elections on Sunday. The development comes following a helicopter crash that killed Iranian President Ebrahim Raisi. The Interior Ministry announced the list after it was endorsed by a 12-member constitutional vetting body overseen by Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Among the 585 other hopefuls who have been disqualified by the council are former 2-term President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. The Guardian Council disqualified Ahmadinejad because he had challenged Khamenei towards the end of his term. Not only this, Ahmadinejad is also remembered for the bloody crackdown on the 2009 Green Movement protests in Iran. This is not the first time that he has been shunned. He was also disqualified in the previous 2 elections in 2017 and 2021. The council has also blocked former Speaker of Parliament Ali Larijani. He is a long-standing parliament speaker and veteran politician, prominent figure in Iranian politics and national security, strong ties to Iran's former relatively moderate president, Hassan Rouhani. Ishaq Jahangiri has also been blocked. He served as the vice president under President Hassan Rouhani. The council's decision to qualify candidates suggests Iran's Shiite theocracy. The election comes amid heightened tensions between Iran and the West over arming of Russia in its war against Ukraine, coupled with its support of militia proxy forces throughout the Middle East and West Asia. Millions of people around the world are dying younger than they should because of dirty air. A study by a university in Singapore found a link between tiny pollution particles and 135 million early deaths between 1980 and 2020. Between 1980 and 2020, about 135 million people died early due to air pollution. These deaths were linked to particulate matters, or PM 2.5. These microscopic particles come from various sources: cars, factories, wildfires, and dust storms all contribute. PM 2.5 is particularly dangerous. It's small enough to enter the bloodstream when inhaled. This can lead to serious health issues: stroke, heart disease, lung problems, and cancer, just to name a few. The study is one of the largest of its kind. It spans 40 years and covers the globe. Researchers use data from NASA, health institutes, and wealth agencies. Weather patterns made things worse. El Nino and the Indian Ocean dipole increased pollution levels. This led to a 14% rise in premature deaths. According to the study, Asia is the hardest hit. Over 98 million early deaths occurred there. China and India saw the highest numbers. Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and Japan also suffered greatly. The study highlights a critical point: climate events can worsen air pollution. This in turn leads to more deaths. Understanding this link is vital for protecting global health. The T20 World Cup is cricket's big push